My talk is on alternatives to invasive ornamental plants, and my goal today is to provide some of the tools to avoid planting invasive plants. These are the topics I'm going to go over. I'm going to just talk about the terms, the definitions of native, non-native, invasive species, so we're all on the same page. And then why we should avoid invasive plants, and some of the organizations in government and non-governmental organizations that oversee this topic, and some of their rating systems. And then importantly, for all of us as master gardeners and gardeners, the public, just how do we know if a plant's invasive to even consider avoiding it? And then some examples of invasive grasses, shrubs, and trees, and then a summary. So to get started, native species are species that grow naturally. They're not introduced. A good example is our California state flower, the California poppy. Just a little feedback. Can Joan or Mike give me a thumbs up if the slides are advancing fine? Okay, super. If they're not, just let me know at any point. The non-native species are those that grow naturally in a given region, but they are introduced by human activities. And very importantly here, it's important to know that not just because a species is introduced by human activities does not make it invasive. It's invasive, it's considered an invasive species if it meets in the third bullet there, a legal definition by federal executive order. An invasive species is considered a non-native species in a region that causes harm to the environment, economy, or human, animal, or plant health. And a good example of an invasive species is shown here, water hyacinth, considered one of the world's worst invasive plants. It's super productive. And it's an aquatic plant, came from the Amazon River basin. It's all over the world. And it causes severe harm, which I'll talk about later. Lavender, in the middle there, as an example, is a beautiful invasive, non-invasive, introduced, non-native, non-invasive, introduced plant. It came from Mediterranean, Europe area, and you see it everywhere. We have it in our garden. It's not a problem in wildland habitat. It's not a problem for our native plant or wildlife species. So why avoid them? Because native species and habitats are severely affected by invasive species. When we have them in our gardens, usually that's intentional, and we don't have a problem with that. We love them. But if they escape to wildland areas where our native habitats and native species, plant and animal, exist, that is when they can be problematic. Or if they escape to agricultural areas. Typical for invasive species, as a general rule, is they typically have a rapid seed and vegetative spread. Seed and or vegetative spread. So they spread rapidly. And they lack natural predators. They don't have the bugs, the fungal diseases and other things in their new habitat that can control them. They're considered the second greatest threat to global biodiversity. And in California, similarly, second greatest only to habitat loss. California, you look on the map on the right, you see as an example is a biodiversity hotspot in the world. There's 34 hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, meaning places where native biological species diversity exists. There's 34 places in the world that are considered hotspots. What makes it a hotspot is the high number of plant species that are only found in California, nowhere else on the planet. Over 2,000 species, plant species found only in California, and less than 25% of the habitat is remaining due to all the conversions that have occurred in California. So that's what makes it a hotspot. In California, over 3,000 plant and wildlife species are declining or vulnerable, and invasive plant species have a lot to do with that. They're not the only reason for the decline. There's climate change, habitat loss, other factors, but they're a substantial, second most substantial reason for that decline. So for agriculture, we're spending over $80 million a year. I frankly think that number is probably low for controlling just invasive species problems on farmland. Similarly, over 30 billion a year for nationwide, and considered over 100 billion a year in the damage, environmental damage from invasive species. As an example, here's tamarisk. Probably have all seen it in roadsides or along riparian areas, meaning stream sides or river sides. It increases fire. It has oil in it, and it just goes up. You see by the middle picture there, it burns incredibly well, and it re-sprouts after fire where a lot of our native riparian species do not. It also leaves salts on the surface of the soil that make it hard for for our native species to re-sprout. I mentioned arundo there. I'm not going to go into it, but arundo is called giant reed or false bamboo, and it spreads vegetatively and causes a lot of flood control issues. Ironically, it was planted decades ago by the Soil Conservation Service as an erosion control plant, but clearly that failed. So why avoid, as another example, water hyacinth? These pictures on the bottom right are of our Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta. That's not a nice surface to walk on. That's the water, and it's just completely covering the water. And what it does is obstructs waterways for boats, makes it hard for irrigation pumps, and breeds for mosquitoes. Interestingly, it's not all bad. It does have a beneficial potential for biologically absorbing sewage and hazardous waste. So if it's used in a controlled manner, it's actually not a bad plant. It's very productive. On the top image, you see that it's available on the internet for mere $13. You can buy it. But if you look at the bottom there, it says in small print, not available to be shipped to California and a number of other states that say, no, 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 don't do that. But, you know, everybody's driven through the borderlines of California from one state to the other. Tell me how hard it is to get that plant across the line if you want to bring it in. Anyhow, it's already here and it's problematic. So why do we care as gardeners, as master gardeners, as home gardeners, as anybody who has plants in their backyard? It's because at least 60%, 2/3 approximately or more, of invasive plants, listed invasive plants, came from horticultural origins. Europeans, immigrants from everywhere in the world have brought their favorite plants in, and we like them when we see something elsewhere, and we like them in the nursery, and we just planted them. And we didn't realize until later that they were problematic. So we need to be teaching other people about this and try to nip it in the bud, avoid it in the first place when we can. So here's a curious story. Tree of Heaven was brought in to the United States. First, it was brought from China to Europe, and the way it was brought was this gentleman, I don't know if it's a gentleman, he was a botanist industrial spy, Pierre de Carville, in the mid-1700s, went to China, to Peking, and he was a French Jesuit missionary moonlighting as a botanist industrial spy. And what he was trying to do was bring the secrets of Chinese, the superior Chinese silk industry to help his French counterparts and the government and the industry in France, which was struggling. And what he found was this plant. He was given the seeds of this plant that was going to be helpful for the woodenware industry as well. And it's the varnish tree, but it was the wrong seeds. It wasn't the Rus verniculiflua that he was given seeds for, it was this tree. And when it got to, he gave it to the English, the British government. And curiously, it spread all over Europe and was found to be this fantastic tree for urban areas because it grew so well in the polluted urban cities of Europe. And by the time they figured out it was actually a disaster because its roots were cutting through and clogging the sewer lines, breaking them, it was already exported to the United States, and by the mid-1800s, it was common in US nurseries. Similarly, in another introduction, the Chinese, just like Europeans and others brought in their favorite plants, the Chinese brought in their favorite plants when they built the railroads. And this reminded them of home when they worked the mines and the railroads. So you'll see this tree along disturbed areas, especially railroads and urban areas. Look for it. It's not the worst plant in the world, but it does have toxicity and is problematic. It grows clonally, and it can, it's considered a moderate problem for native plants. And curiously, it does also support the silkworm. So why he brought this in and gave it to the English, not the French, as a varnish tree and not a silk tree makes me wonder if it was intentional, because it's actually good for the silk growing. So something intriguing there. The species that, the organizations that cover invasive plants include California Department of Fish and Agriculture, which is interested in mostly agriculture, but also natural resources and urban problems areas. The University of California at Davis has a fantastic weed research and information center. And as part of my Master Gardener training, which I recommend to everyone, it's fantastic. I'm a newbie this year. They had a specialist from the Weed Research and Information Center teach the class on invasive species. The California Invasive Plant Council and Plant Right are non-governmental organizations mostly interested in the protection of natural resources. Plant Right is trying to change the nursery industry to avoid selling invasive plants. And they both have rating systems. California Department of Food and Ag has A, B, and C, mostly based on how prevalent they are. A means it's really not here very much and we can keep it out. B means it's more it's more prevalent but still containable. And C means it's very widespread but still problematic. An example of seed is yellow star thistle, which people may be familiar with, is pretty much everywhere in the state. It's very problematic. It can be toxic to grazing animals, and yet it's everywhere. So it can't be eradicated, but a local agricultural commissioner may choose to try to do something about it in their county. The California Invasive Plant Council has ratings that are really based on ecological concerns and prevalence. High, moderate, and limited are basically how common they are, and alert and watch are to try to prevent things that might be coming in that aren't yet prevalent. Important to note here, there are over 1,000 species in California that were introduced that are not on the list, either because they're not invasive or because they're so naturalized now, like the annual grassland of California. The species in that annual grassland were really from Europe and the Mediterranean area, and have overtaken all of our grasslands around the state. There's very little native grassland species left. It's about 99% non-native grassland. So they're not going to be on this list if they're already so far along, basically. If you go to the California Invasive Plant Council's Don't Plant a Pest site, if you just Google that, or I should say internet search that, you might be using Safari like I did. You can find this site, and it breaks things down by geography, such as the Central Valley, by the strata or structural level in an ecosystem, such as grassland layer or shrub layer or tree layer. And it'll indicate the invasive plants to avoid and recommended plants to replace them. Similarly, plant rights invasive plant list will give indication broken down by the structural layer, like invasive grasses. Here at the top left, you see green fountain grass or Pennisetum cetacean, which I mentioned earlier. Oh, maybe I didn't, because I'm good next. But there's invasive alternatives indicated there, and nicely they indicate where those plants can grow based on the sunset zones, sunset guide zones. So here's some examples. Invasive grasses, some of these may surprise you. Just on our street, we see people planting, unfortunately, we've seen people planting Mexican feather grass, and that's a really pretty feather grass plant, but it's spread all over our street. And so be careful, try to avoid this. It's still being sold in the nurseries, so far as I'm aware. Pennisetum similarly is still available so far as I'm aware, and you'd see that commonly everywhere. It's not so much a problem up here, but the Southern California coastal scrub community is really affected by this. It increases fire and it's taking over that habitat. Alternatives, not just grasses, but other grassland level alternatives include lavender, deer grass, New Zealand flax. There's many, many alternatives. And invasive forbs and vines, I included poison hemlock here, which I don't know anybody's going to plant that in their garden, but it will grow naturally because it's so common in disturbed areas. And I want people to be aware that it's toxic. So you really want to avoid that, avoid having disturbed areas and avoid that plant. English ivy is another common in forested areas. And some alternatives, some beautiful alternatives, in my opinion, are Virginia's bower and hummingbird sage. Invasive shrub layer, scarlet wisteria in the riparian areas. It's beautiful but toxic and displaces riparian plants. French broom in the forested areas is really promotes fire and can take over habitat, and it's toxic as well. Alternatives here include some of the alternatives are island snapdragon, flannel bush, our native Fremontodendron californicum, and woolly rock rose, which we have in our garden, and it's really lovely. Brazilian pepper tree and Russian olive may surprise some people because it's so commonly planted, in my opinion, but it also has taken over many wildland areas and is problematic, displacing native plants. Allelopathic means it puts chemicals on the soil that make it difficult for other plants to sprout. Some alternatives include fruitless olive, Japanese snowbell, and fern pine, among many other alternatives. So again, they don't have to be native species to be an alternative. There's plenty of non-invasive plants such as these that you can use as alternatives. Non-invasive introduced plants. So in summary, how am I doing on time? Okay, we'll have time for some questions, I think. Not all non-native species are invasive. Here, there's a picture on the right of an example of what Jubeda grass, people have heard pampas grass, this is related. They're actually two separate species, and Jubeda grass is the more common one on the coastal scrub. This is along the ocean mountains, the coastal scrub. Petra and I have watched it take over since she did her research on the coastal scrub of California 30 years ago. We've been watching this plant absolutely take over 100% of some areas, completely displacing the native coastal scrub. Invasive species spread rapidly, such as you see in that picture, through high seed productivity or vegetative spread. What people did with this plant is when they got married, they would take one of these beautiful stalks and stick it on their antenna. Nobody has those antennas anymore, and drive down the freeway. We're married. They propagated. Avoiding invasive species protects our incredible biodiversity. And so please tell, if you're a master gardener or just your neighbor, hey, when you think about planting a plant, see if check out if it's non-invasive first. If it's listed as an invasive plant, please try to avoid it. Bunch of resources. This is available for anybody who wants this presentation, if you want these links. And picture on the right is the water hyacinth. Water hyacinth again on the bottom. That was a spoof. On April 1st, they said, we've got the solution to water hyacinth. Here it is. It's the, what was that, water buffalo? Hippopotamus. They did not introduce the hippopotamus to the California Bay Delta, but everybody believed it. It was in the newspapers. So pop quiz, is this plant invasive? I don't know if we'll open it up. You'll have to do a self-analysis on your quiz results here. But if you know this is the California state plant, poppy, California poppy, you would say, no, of course not. It's our state flower. It's native, but it's also invasive. All these states, and probably more, and other countries have found it to be an invasive plant in their region. Oops. So here we go. We're not only recipients of invasives, but we're the apparent exporters of invasives. with that, I will take questions. I can't hear you, Joan. Still not. No.
Okay, how about now?
Bingo.
What are the chances of finding an invasive plant for sale in a nursery? Any recommendations to avoid?
Yes. Thanks to California Invasive Plant Council and Plant Right, those two organizations I mentioned, thankfully, the likelihood has gone down substantially, at least in the category of known invasive, listed invasive plants. However, that doesn't mean, because nurseries are always looking around the world for something cool and new to sell. And personally, I suspect that some of those plants that are not yet listed as invasives are going to be invasive. And so if it tends to spread rapidly, either by seed or vegetatively, that's a clue that you should be, you know, thinking, could this be a problem? But it's not really up to us to make that decision, unfortunately, is whether it's invasive or not. It ends up being, does it really spread in agricultural or wildland areas? So I would say that most have been removed from nurseries. That's a good thing. And if it spreads rapidly when you hear about it or see it, then that's a clue to be careful. But go to the Plant Right website or Cal UCCE website and look up the plant that you're interested in buying. And if it's listed, then avoid it.
Dottie had a comment, Lemuria and Dixon sells Stipia, as does Lowe's in Vacaville.
Yeah, so like I said, it's diminished, but it's not entirely eliminated. And plants are always, so what I would say is if it's on the Plant Right or Cal UCCE site, maybe go to that nursery and say, hey, did you know? We would like you to consider not selling it anymore.
There was also a request to go back to the non-invasive grasses. Could you go back to that screen?
Hopefully I'm not making anybody sick.
And that's it. There are no more questions.
So that's the invasive grasses. And here's just a few non-invasive grasses. I don't know if this is the slide they were suggesting. And these aren't all grasses, and there's plenty more opportunities. These are just some examples.
And one last question came in. What are they doing to get rid of the water hyacinths?
Water hyacinth.
Well, the California Department of Boating and Waterways sprays it and mechanically removes it every year. It's a multi-million-dollar control effort, and they every year, depending on the conditions of that year, they're fighting an uphill battle.
That's it.
All right, thank you. I'll pass the baton to Petra.
Right, got it. Please switch. Oh. So. Oh, that didn't work, did it? Oh, still sharing the wrong screen. Sorry about that here. Hold on. Too many screens. think now we have the right one. Except, all right, can you see this okay? All right, so can you hear me okay too? All right, so my name is Petra Unger. I'm also a first year master gardener. Just got trained this last year, and this is like Ron's presentation, a variation on our student project. So my presentation is on wildlife friendly gardening. I am a biologist by training, and I work as a consulting biologist. So my focus is on botany and plants, but I really like wildlife and native plants and communities too, which is why I picked this topic. Why wildlife friendly gardening? So there's a lot of benefits. It provides habitat for those native wildlife species, and therefore by having those native wildlife and plant species, we can support conservation like Ron mentioned. But it also helps us manage pests, and it can be fun and educational, especially if you garden with children or if you like to observe wildlife in your garden. It also supports citizen science if we report what we view in our gardens, and everybody can do their part in restoration and conservation. And so I have a quote here from Doug Tallamy, who is a professor of entomology and ecology at the University of Delaware, and he's a big promoter of these wildlife friendly gardening and our gardens playing a role in conservation on a larger scale. So he says, in the past, we've only asked that our gardens be pretty, but now we ask a lot more of them. We want them to, provide wildlife and habitat, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and also manage water. So we're now starting to look at our gardens in a much broader scale, not just something pretty to look at or some pretty flowers to have out there. And he also comments on the importance of local habitats. So natural ecosystems are comprised of many interactions between the soils and the plants and the wildlife and the insects. And similar to what Ron mentioned for California, of the total land mass in the lower 48 states, there's very little that remains completely untouched by any kind of management. We've converted a lot of our open space lands to grazing. We have converted a lot of natural habitats to transportation ways and infrastructure in cities and so on. And the smaller that remaining natural part gets, the more important the habitat value becomes. And so our gardens do provide habitat for those animals, but they also then in turn, we get other ecosystem services from those animals, like they might be controlling our pests by eating our bugs. They pollinate all of our crops that we plant, and they also help with seed dispersal. So how can we support native wildlife in our yards? So one important aspect is the host plants that support that wildlife. So host plants are specific plants that are needed by native wildlife for their food, for example. That can be the leaves or the berries or the fruit or the nectar, or it can be also a specific plant that provides shelter for a plant. And we know from research, extensive research on this, that native landscapes provide a lot more, like up to 35 times more biomass of caterpillars, for example, than non-native landscapes. And that is simply because our native animals or native insects and butterflies are adapted to those native plants. So therefore, if you have those in your yard or your open space, they will come to that. And then we also know that most of our native birds heavily rely on feeding those caterpillars for their to their young and rearing their chicks. So here's a few examples of butterflies, native California butterflies and their host plants. And these are all things you can have in your garden. Here up on top is the top right is the pipevine swallowtail, which feeds exclusively on the Dutchman's pipe. And this is its caterpillar. And so a great example, we planted one of these in our backyard, and 2 years later, we observed these butterflies right here in our yard. So it's definitely one of those, if you build it or if you put it in there, it'll come. A well-known other example is the monarch butterfly, which feeds on the milkweed. And I don't know if you've been following in the news, but there was a lot of concern about the monarchs really being in peril because of climate change and other kind of out of sync food sources, but it looks like this year is actually a good year for them to return. So there's a lot of positive news out there about this year's monarch return. So that's been really excited to see. And then on the bottom right here, we have the California sister caterpillar and butterfly, and those are not exclusive to one plant, but they all on one plant, but they are on native oak trees. So if you have native oak trees in your yard, you can, or nearby, you can expect to see those California sisters. That same goes true for birds. So this is a native hummingbird feeding on a bladderpot, which is a native plant, and this is our images from the Yolo County Audubon. So right here from our Native Audubon Society, or a cedar waxwing on a toyon or heteromelus on native plants. So just again, attracting native wildlife with native plants to your yard. Those caterpillars are really essential in many ways. They transfer energy from the plants to the wildlife area, and they are a good source of carotenoids and other essential nutrients. And like I said, most of the songbirds rear their young on these caterpillars because they're big and large and nutritious and so much more efficient than trying to feed aphids, for example, to your baby chick. And we know that it takes about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise just one clutch of chicks. So the more we can provide those caterpillars, the better. And you don't have to worry about that these caterpillars will eat your tomato plants or something. They're different than the hornworms or something. That the native, they're pretty specific to their host plants, and they will not eat or put their eggs on your garden plants. So it's a good thing to have these around for many reasons. Other things they do is they're of course host plants for many butterflies and insects. So here are some native shrubs, and these are all taken in our garden. They're all very pretty, just to look at and to enjoy the flowers as well. So we still have that pretty aspect. So we have the California redbud on the top left. The yellow one is the Fremontodendron or flannel bush, manzanita at the bottom left, and then the California lilacs, which there are a lot of them out there in the horticultural market, and they're really pretty. Same goes for perennial plants. Again, these are all in our garden. There's the Matilaha poppy, the sticky monkey flower, the orange one top right. The bottom right is that hummingbird sage that Ron had as one of his alternatives to native plants, and the bottom left is the penstemons. So here's some good tools about what if you're interested in doing some wildlife friendly gardening or just attracting more native butterflies and insects and birds to your yard. This is called the CalScape tool. It's put out by the California Native Plant Society, and it really aims at landscape professionals because, as you mentioned, a lot of those plants are sold in nurseries, and things like those fountain grasses are really plants that are often used by developers to, plant their initial landscapes. But this is a tool for landscapers, but also home gardeners to, look at what might be more appropriate if they're interested. So you can put here, I put in, for example, that I'm local to Davis and my garden style is California natural. Like I don't mind things being a little bit messy, but you can put in here that you prefer a more formal garden look, and it'll give you plants that are maybe more adherent to that look. And then I said, okay, what would I plant in partial shade? And I'm also interested in bird watching. And again, these parameters, you pick what you want, but it'll always give you a list of appropriate plants to that will do well, appropriate native plants that will do well in these criteria that you choose here. And not only that, but it'll give you some ideas for landscaping, some sort of very preliminary layout plans. So it's a really fun tool to play around with or find what you already have in your garden to say, hey, great, I already have a lot of these there, and there's some others that are compatible that I might want to plant to supplement. Other features that help support birds and other wildlife in your yard is, avoid pesticides whenever you can. Those birds and other native species will help you keep those insect population in check. And then bird feeders are a great way to attract birds to your yard. It's most important during the winter or in the spring and fall migration. So here's some bird feeders in our yard. So you want to use high energy foods such as sunflower seeds. You want to really maintain them and clean them out regularly to prevent having some sort of diseases come up there. And if you use the hummingbird feeders, those red feeders with the sugar solutions, they should really be cleaned every 3 to 5 days to stay clean of germs and so on. And then you do want to look for local alerts like this last winter, there was an alert from Yolo Audubon that there was an outbreak of salmonella affecting some of those birds. So they actually asked everybody to take their feeders down for a while. So just want to be aware of that. And then also you want to protect them from rodents. So this long stalk that our birds are hanging on is just the rats or other rodents can climb up this so they don't come and clean this out instead of your birds. Here's another fun online tool if you want to attract more wildlife. It's from the Cornell lab. They do a lot of bird work. They have some very good birding apps as well. And so what you can do here is you can indicate what region you're in and what kind of feeder, your food type you're putting out and what kind of tube feeder. And then it'll give you a list of the birds you can expect to see in your region based on that. And so then you can, you know, like, say I've observed some bird, I don't know what they are, this will give you a list of things. And if you change that here and put a different kind of seed here, it'll tell you the birds that are eating that seed. So this is a really fun way for non-birders to know what kind of birds they're seeing out on their feeders. A water feature is also very nice. It's important for drinking and bathing of all kinds of wildlife. This is the fountain in our backyard. So birds really like that moving water. You can see them bathing on top and drinking from those springs. It also, having moving water prevents mosquitoes from becoming established on there. And it keeps the algal growth down, though we do have to clean them out pretty regularly. If you do use dishes, make sure that they stay clean, again, to prevent diseases. Never add any chemicals to prevent algal growth, so no chlorine or anything like that. And a birdhouse for nesting nearby is also a nice way. And so you can see here just kind of how busy that little bird bath is. It's really fun to watch, and it's just amazing the kind of diversity that comes by. And then the bottom right, our local hawk has also learned that there's lots of birds coming by our fountain. So he also sticks around and watches who might be visiting the fountain to look for a snack. Other ways to support birds in your yard, if you do have a cat, keeping your cat indoors will really help the local bird population. So our local Audubon in Yolo County estimates that outdoor cats kill 1.3 to 4 billion birds a year in the US. So that's more predation predation from cats exceeds all other mortality causes combined. So they really can be pretty detrimental. So a fun idea I found here, and I actually saw this, Ron mentioned we just got back from Germany and somebody had enclosed their outdoor balcony with one of these screens and then had kind of all these cat platforms to watch out there. So it was fun. I should have taken a picture of that. Another thing that is nice to do is to participate in citizen science. So if you observe this wildlife in your yard, whether that be lizards or insects or birds, it's nice to report on it because it helps scientists understand trends in our backyards and in nature in general or in a specific region. So there's different platforms or ideas where you can report what you see, or you can even upload pictures, such as on iNaturalist. You can take a picture of a bird and upload it there and say, what is this? And somebody will identify it for you and get back to you. Or if you observe something and upload it and say, I observed cedar waxwings in my yard, if there's two people agreeing with your identification of that species, it will become science grade observation, which means it can be used by researchers for trends. So some really nice ways to participate, and this is really fun with kids, but really fun for anybody if you're interested in that. Another way to support wildlife in your yard is bats. So they like to roost in attics or chimneys, porches and eaves or shingles. So we actually have birds on all of our bats on all of our overhead hangs around the house. and it gives them protection from predators and a stable temperature. You'll know you'll have bats by either observing them when they, you can hear them if you can hear high-pitched noises. So usually before they come out at night, you'll hear like high-pitched chirping, but then you can see them emerge. But you will also see their droppings around the cracks and crevices. So they're little pellets, like mouse-like droppings under eaves and such like that. And they're really beneficial to have around because they eat a lot of insects, and they can be fun to watch. So we have certainly enjoyed watching those bats come out at night. If you do not like bats in your house, I know some people are freaked out about that and do have them, but want to exclude them, then you should follow expert advice on the timing and the methods, because there's a certain season when bats have their pups, and the pups can't fly until they're a certain age. So you want to make sure that you don't, seal up those cracks and inadvertently prevent somebody from either the chicks, the pups from coming out, or the mothers to return to their young. So the best time to do that is usually in the fall. Like by now, all the bats are gone. So if you want to exclude bats, the fall and winter are good times to do that. And you can also install a bath house. You can buy them already made, or you can buy kits online. It's another fun project you can do with a kid or by yourself. Again, you shouldn't use pesticides. They're your natural pest control. Pregnant or nursing mothers, they consume nearly their body weight in insect each night, which tells you just how much they contribute to the local indoor population. And again, keeping cats indoors or away from the bats will help them out as well. And this is just some of the sources I used for the presentation and where to find those online resources. And that is the end. How do I do on time?
It's 3:50
Okay.
and no questions came in, but there was one last question that came in late, and it's about the stinkwort.
Oh, the stinkwort, the native, I'm sorry, the invasive plant. Yeah, do you know much about stinkwort? It's one that it has become a big kind of rangeland weed especially in the Bay Areas where I've come across it. And I'm not even sure where it's from. I don't know a whole lot about it. I know that in some of the open space parks that they spend a lot of money on, managing it and trying to keep it out.
Stacy said that it's all over the field of the cannery.
It's all over the cannery property in Davis.
Yeah, that area where they just plowed to start building again. That it was all stinkwort in there before they plowed it.
Oh wow!
So they should go to the weed research and information.
Yes, that Ron said the UC Research and Information Center, or Cal-IPSI. I think they should have good information on I think we know it's invasive, but the UC Davis management site, they should have information on the best known management methods to control it. And
Do
maybe
you know if
sometimes the responsible people don't even know, like if the developer or whoever is doing the work there might not be aware of that kind of stuff, or the city might not be aware.
I've actually emailed the city with concerns about Tree of Heaven. And I just haven't gotten any response. I've emailed a couple of times just to find out if they have an invasive plant management program, if that's on their radar, if they have volunteer program where people can help.
Let's see if I can pop in. They did some work over in our area in South Davis decades ago, on Tree of Heaven that was clonally widely, spreading on the Greenbelt. I know that the city is always strapped for personnel and resources, so I'm not going to make any excuses for the city. I'm not working for the city.
Sure.
But that's probably one of the constraints. The other is that it's not considered generally to be the worst weed in the world. So what I did when we did years ago, the South Davis project, I helped volunteer with them. That might be one way to do it. Another is just to keep trying to get in contact with them and see if you can get something going.
Sounds good.
That's it. There are no more questions.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining and listening to our talks. Again, it was a pleasure to do so, to give them.
And if people want our presentations, they can go through you, Joan, or
Yeah,
Mike,
and-
is that right?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll send it to be posted on the Master Gardener website.
great, super. Thanks for having us.
Well,
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you
Merle.
very, that was
Thank
great.
you very
Yeah.
much.
So, so let me jump in. So the next session will be on the 18th. That'll be the last one of the year. We'll take the holidays off and then we'll see. And we're gonna do both beneficial and pest insects and something on critters and, you know, how to encourage the good ones and discourage the trouble. So 3 o'clock on the 8th.
Okay,
Okay,
bye.
I don't know if anybody heard that.
Yeah.
Everybody seems,
I think
Yes,
Mike.
we did.
Yes.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
3 o'clock,
Yes,
Okay.
thank
November
you.
18th.
Thanks for
Beneficial,
doing it.
Yep.
beneficial insects.
All right.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
all right.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Ron
Ron
and
and Petra.
Petra.
That was great. Thank you.